Gigabyte has outlined 4 new products that I want to talk about, and this press release came out that I'm going to show you on 9/23/2021. Today is the 29th. I've had enough time to read about it, and I'll just say 2 products that really are of interest and are of special attention to us. One of those is anything to do with the WRX80, and number 2, anything that relates to the TRX40. So I want to share some information with you about those 4 products, but as this relates, again, to our build specs, where we've talked about 4 different levels of builds. Number 1, the entry level, where we've talked about a 10-core build. Okay, and I'm not going to get into the rest of the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. I'm just going to stick with the basics so we can get into this press release. Number 2 would be on a B550 chipset with a 16-core machine, and that's where this press release comes into play. And with the picture being worth 1,000 words, of these 4 products, I'm going to start at the bottom, which would be what we call and define as our second level build with a B550. And that is the W331-Z, which is a W331-Z00, and that's based on the B550 chipset. So I'm going to go into this link, and I've also got a couple of articles that came out about this, one through, I believe, WCCF Tech and the other through Tom's, that gives some information, but I want to get into the meat of it. Now, we do not have information for manuals, nothing on PDF, and I doubt we will until the product's released. But of the number one thing that we're always interested in, for those of you that keep up with what we do, this is Builder By. My name's Gil Boyd. Welcome. And we advocate because we think the best bang for the buck is on the TRX40, and it happens to be the designator because we have Thunderbolt 3 support. None of these products have Thunderbolt support, but from a workstation standpoint, to classify a B550 as a workstation, that doesn't work for me. But I want to show you some server management functions that might be why they classify that, because right now, as we look at the specs on that machine, and I'll show you the pictures we get into it, that is a strictly OEM bare bones motherboard with an OEM bare bones case. There's nothing special about it. Let's take a look. So we're going to start right here with the W331-Z. And this particular motherboard, again to reiterate, is based on the B550 chipset. It does all the good things where we can support a 16-core CPU, it supports overclocking, it supports dual channel, DDR4 up to 3200. It'll do 128 gigs of RAM. Okay, this is what we classify as a secondary system. Getting into the specifications, is we look over here under System Management. That's really where this stands out with the Realtek Dash Remote Management. Power state settings, view hardware, firmware, BIOS versions, retrieve system health status, USB device redirection, boot device selection, view event logs, apply updates and security patches, test console redirection, software KVM. Okay, from the standpoint of one computer versus several computers. Okay, for our secondary level machine, as we've outlined with the Asus ProArt B550 Creator, that has Thunderbolt 4 on it. This does not have Thunderbolt anything on it. This has some system management capabilities, so if you go from one computer to lots of computers, I can see where something like that would be beneficial. However, from our perspective and from our standpoint, if I were doing a classroom full of computers, I would not select this system. I would still go for the Asus ProArt B550, but that's just my opinion based on what I know about hardware specifications. Let's keep going. Now for the CPU, even though we advocate a 16-core CPU, this motherboard will accept a 3rd generation Ryzen with Radeon graphics. So if you're trying to build a low-end machine, I can see where something like this might come in handy. But if you're trying to build something for content creation, for rendering, no, this is not where I would go. To me, it's like a redirect. And as one subscriber, I think it was Max that said, I think once everybody understands all this issue about PCI Express resources, when we stop accepting stuff like this and start saying, we want more resources, we need a better, higher performance chipset, that right now is on the TRX40, where we have 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. It's all about resource management. And something like this, that's just a neutered motherboard. So what you're doing is catering to building a brand new computer that's going to have to be upgraded a lot sooner, instead of whereas we advocate building a computer that's going to last for a little while so you can get through some of these technology gaps that we're going through. PCI Express 5 is coming out, PCI Express 6 is coming out, PCI Express 5 may be short-lived. So it's brace for impact, because PCI Express 4 is right now in its current. And yes, we're going to be looking at some more of the PCI Express 4.0, whether you call them 2nd or 3rd generation drives. A lot of you have been asking. I appreciate that. And I'll just say, stay tuned. Back to the specs. But even though this will support 128 gigs of memory, this is not a machine that I would put 128 gigs of memory on. It has 2 gigabit LAN ports, and those are Realtek chips. And I mentioned the CPU because it has video ports on it. One display port that'll get you up to 4K 60, which is significant, as well as one HDMI that again will also get you up to 4K 60, and that's significant. Interesting to note, RAID is not available on this particular motherboard. And again, we don't have the manual, so all we can do is go by this amount of information they've provided on this spec sheet. As far as PCI Express resources, there is one PCI Express by 16 slot, so that's integrated to the CPU. Then you have one PCI Express by 8 slot, goes through the chipset, and one PCI Express by 1 slot, again, that goes through the chipset. So that looks like a dedicated resource for a 16-lane slot. There is support, it says, for 2 M.2 drives, and it looks like PCI Express 4 by 4 lanes, and SATA 3 6 gigabit, which would be 1 lane. I would want to see some details on that, if that actually supports 2 PCI Express 4.0 by 4 drives, but it's kind of a moot point because it's not a board that I would use or recommend. But I wanted to hit the high points. We'll take a look at support. There's nothing here about a BIOS. There's a chipset driver, a SATA RAID AHCI driver. Of course, it just said it doesn't support RAID, but this shows a RAID driver, so that's kind of a mixed piece of information. Resources are just some videos, blah, blah, blah. The main thing are the specifications. I've downloaded the images for this that I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, just to reiterate and show you what we're talking about. A very low-end generic case. It's got 2 5.25-inch drive bays, 1 3.5. Looks like we have 2 USB 3 ports, audio, and looks like a punch out for what used to be 1394 Firewire. Yeah, 1394. That tells you how new the case is. The case has been around for a while, so they're just trying to regurgitate something that's been with us for a while. Nothing fancy to see. The reason I wanted to show this is because I always like to look at a motherboard and study it. Motherboard always tells an interesting story, and we're going to get to the others here in a minute. And no USB-C on this case, nor on the I/O panel on the back, but I thought it worth taking a look. And there again is the HDMI and the display port to get video out of it, so you don't have to install a video card with a lower end CPU. But again, I think you'd be better off with the Asus B550 ProArt Creator instead of this. Now there's a real good picture of the motherboard, so we can take a look. We get a better idea here of the slots. So to reiterate, even though there's 2 16-lane slots mechanically, electrically there's 1 16-lane slot, 1 8-lane slot, and a single-lane slot. And I will point out, you see these little devices right here? That device right there, and that device right there? Those are thermistors. And you notice that connector right there? That's for an M.2, and that's for an M.2. The reason I want to point that out, because those of you that have been keeping up with the M.2 NVMe drives that we've been testing, and with the heat sinks that we've been testing, yes, we're looking forward to getting to the Seagate FireCuda 530, but separate video. Anyway, to reiterate, those are thermistors, so we can now measure the heat off of an M.2 drive from the motherboard, not just from the primary place, which has always been the thermistor on the M.2 NVMe drive, which can only be tested based on AMD RAID when the drive is out of RAID. I know that's a mouthful, but I like that, the fact that we now have thermistors on the motherboard. I hope we're going to be seeing more of that. And the reason I say that, because as we move up the food chain in this press release, I've noticed the same thing on another motherboard that I want to show you. But I didn't realize it was on this little low-end board. We need to see that on all the motherboards that have an M.2 drive. And I would expect going forward, PCI Express 5.0, we're going to see thermistors on the motherboard so we can keep an eye on the heat on those drives. I think it's kind of like, I remember when they put thermistors underneath the CPUs a very long time ago. For a long time we didn't have them. One day someone said, you know, we need to do that. Brilliant idea, great idea. Well, same thing here, it's about time. So I'm glad to see a thermistor. So that means there'll be 2 ways to check the heat on a drive. One with hardware info, where we can look at the smart telemetry off of the M.2 drive. And number 2, we can check this from the motherboard or hardware info to see what kind of heat we're getting. So we're going to have 2 different ways of looking at heat on an M.2 drive. To me, that's significant. So when I get to the next one and show it on another motherboard, I won't go into the details that I have right now, but that's a big deal. As always, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And we can tell right here, looks like we've got 4 SATA ports on the board, and we've got 4 slots for memory to get to 128 gigs. And we don't have all that fancy cowling on the board, So that means there's an I/O panel, which is a separate I/O panel, which is different from the I/O panels we've come to find already attached to the motherboard, which is kind of interesting. And there's the motherboard battery, which is kind of high up. Motherboard batteries are usually a little further down. And my guess would be that's probably the chipset right there. Power, of course, is over here behind this drive cage. And I don't see anything extra for cooling through here. So they must not be expecting a lot. But what's significant, again, to reiterate, are the thermistors on the two M.2 NVMe drives. That's what I wanted to point out. Oh, and the motherboard has USB 3, so that's the 19-pin header, which is what we saw to the front of the case. 2 ports. Okay, so much for that motherboard. Now let's move up the food chain to the third level machine, which is the high-end desktop, which is the TRX40. Yes, we have a new TRX40 motherboard that's been announced, and it's kind of interesting the way they have this position because we've talked about this. Let me show you. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Now we're going to move down to this one, which is the model G182-C20. And that is a TRX40 in a 1-unit rack mount case. Pretty wicked, right? Because we talked about putting a TRX40 in a case, like this one. But to do that, because of the height of the cooler, we've got to go to, well, we could put this in a 4-unit case, and this is the Gigabyte TRX40 Designaire. But to put this in a 4-unit tall case, 4-unit rack high, we have to use a different Noctua cooler, the one that's a little bit lower, because with this cooler it sticks up just right at the knobs on the cooler. Let me show you, which would be at this point. It would fit just right on top of this, but would not clear these pieces that stand up, which are the ends of the heat pipes through the heat sink. So they make one that sits a little bit lower, and the reason for that, so that we can then get one of these mounted in a 4-unit case. Okay, that's one issue solved. The other problem is the depth front to back. The width is fine in a 19-inch rack mount, but later we're going to eventually show one. These are XLATX. This B550 that we just showed you is a ATX. They don't give the specifications on the motherboard in that case for 1 unit, but I can tell you whatever it is, because it's 1 unit tall. Well, there's some things we need to look at, because I'm not advocating it that I would want to do it, because let me show you why. As I talk about the depth of this case, this motherboard, which stops right about here to right here, this is XLATX. I'm okay this way, but the problem is right here, because rack mount cases typically are sized for ATX. So I've got the perfect rack mount case, and it's not just the case, but it's the rack mount case, and then the mobile case that fits into, so you can move it around. Because a rack mount computer, from our perspective, would be in 2 places. One, for a digital audio workstation, which means could be in a studio, which means it's got to be quiet or else it's got to be separate. Or 2, could be in a studio situation for a video studio, which again, you got to worry about noise, you got to worry about heat. You can have some amount of both, but you got to have some way to manage that. So it's got to be in a console. That would not necessarily be something like this, because you got to have more depth. Okay, why is that important? Because this one we're looking at, as this depth is a problem going to XLATX, that's a bigger problem to accommodate everything that's going in that case to keep it in 1 unit, which means that cannot be mobile. It cannot fit in a digital audio workstation because the depth of the rack, unless the rack is someplace separate, because instead of using, like we have here, 120 millimeter fans, we're looking at 40 millimeter fans. So, do the math. 40 millimeter fans, smaller fans, we learned a long time ago when we used to use 80 millimeter fans on a case like this. More noise. More noise is bad. Not a good thing. So you can imagine the noise that's going to make, but it'll also accommodate 2 GPUs. So even though I have 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots, in this machine, you have 2 16-lane slots. That's it. So you could put, theoretically, 2 GPUs. More realistically, you'd have maybe 1 GPU, 1 quad card. Well, this is a better deal for the money. You just have to figure out how you're going to accommodate it. But I want to point this out because this is a big deal. Let's go back to the specs. So looking at the G182-C20. Now this one is being marketed as an AMD Ryzen Threadripper server system application. AI, artificial intelligence, AI training, AI inference, and HPC for high performance computing. Okay, this will take up to 2 PCI Express 4.0 GPUs, and again, this is a GPU that we're not talking a consumer GPU, which is another discussion, but we're talking about a workstation class GPU. 3rd generation Ryzen Threadripper, which is what we talk about. It'll do quad channel, ECC, non-ECC, so DDR4, 8 DIMMs, and it's got the Intel X550-AT2 on it, which is pretty cool. One dedicated management port. It'll support 2 SATA Generation 3 NVMe hot swappable drive SSD bays, 2.5 inch. Interesting. So it only supports PCI Express 3, but then it also has ultra-fast PCI Express 4.0x4 for an M.2, and it talks about 2 FHFL PCI Express Generation 4 expansion slots. FHFL meaning full height, full length. We'll get to the image and I'll show you. This will support 2 1600 watt redundant power supplies. Okay, that means those GPUs have to be 2 slots wide to fit in the space because they're not standing up, they're laying down. But 2 1600 watt power supplies, this is some serious muscle to do some serious processing power. So I can see this in a server room where you're not so much worried about noise, but you're more concerned about processing power. And for the amount of resources it's going to provide, it looks like a good mix on the TRX40. And I think there will be some places where it will be appropriate. However, if you think you're going to go from 1 to 2 to 4 GPUs, we got to keep going. But I want to do an overview and look at the board to see how all this lays out, because I think that's significant and important. Something I want to point out here under full height, full length GPUs. This question has come up before, and I think this is a good way to address it. Someone said, well, can you put like say an RTX 3090 with an RTX A5000 and link them? No, doesn't work that way. And here's a good explanation. It just says system is validated for population with a uniform GPU model, meaning they need to be the same. Support is not provided for mixed GPU populations. And another question came up asking, well, how does the computer see 2 GPUs if they're bridged? It still sees 2 GPUs. You have a primary and a secondary. System management has the AS speed management controller on it, so you get all the benefits from that. So in a server room, I can see where systems like this stack to harness the processing power would be a handy thing. And this is where it gets really interesting, the operating system compatibility. Windows 10 64-bit and 2 versions of Linux. Now the package dimensions, 985 millimeters. That's like 39 inches deep. So when we're talking about depth on a case, that's not going to work in a rack mount that you want to do something mobile. So for anyone doing live streaming that wants to have a rack mounted TRX40, that looks great on paper, but because of the depth, that's not going to work. That's strictly to be mounted in a server room. That's not something you're going to move around, because it's too much this way. We've got to work within 4 units tall to keep the depth, and it's got to be ATX. The problem is we don't have a TRX40 that's ATX. The problem is they're all XL ATX. So all these things, as I say, change one thing, changes everything. Back to the specs. And for those that want to pursue that direction in the part numbers, and this would be really important, the bare bone with the rail kit, you definitely want to use to get the rails. Those are a necessity, because when you get a box like that, or any computer that's rack mounted, when you try to pull it out of that rack, you got to have rails, because it's not like you're picking up the computer. You're pulling the computer out, and then all of a sudden you've got all that weight on you. So you need those rails for those that want to go down that path. And under support, they do now have a BIOS listed for this, but all they have is a Windows and Unified EFI mode flash BIOS update tool, not the BIOS itself. There's also a firmware, the BMC firmware, and that's for the server management console. It lists a manual. Aha! When I looked at this a day ago, that manual was not available. All we had was the stuff for the GSM, the server, management console, and the GSM agent. So that, it says 9/10/2021. No, that came out sometime between today and yesterday, and today's the 29th. What I want to take a look at, because a picture's worth 1,000 words, I'm going to pull these images. I have to select them all and download them, and then we'll take a close-up look at the motherboard. That's where things get really interesting. So we can now get a better look at the layout of how this thing works in the front. A couple of LAN access ports, a couple of USB 3 ports. There's another LAN access port, and there's the 2 bays for hot swap right on the front. Nice. 2 power supplies, redundant. And this image does not show, let me show you another that shows the GPUs. Okay, there's a better picture showing those GPUs in the back. And you get an idea, you see where that break line is right there? I'll highlight right through there where the mouse is at. It gives you an idea about how deep a regular case is, and that case has been extended all the way back for a lot to accommodate from that point back, GPU 1 and GPU 2. And yes, I see that, and I know I'm going to get the questions on it. This is PCI Express 4, and I see the cables they're using. I want to know more about those riser cables, because that's PCI Express 4.0. I can see a lot of people are going to be wanting to order those riser cables to use in other configurations. So apparently Gigabyte has solved a problem that we have not been able to solve with consumer products, because there they are. That's a riser cable for PCI Express 4.0 to use on a GPU that would fit in those two slots. And those two slots still do not show the GPUs. I thought they did. Let me see if there's another image that does. Let me see if I can find it. There we are. Let's move in on that. There's the two GPUs, blower style. Now, for all we know, those could be RTX 3090 Founder Editions. More than likely, though, they're an RTX A series. And we also have another subscriber that wants to put 4 A100s in a case. We're going to get more into that, which kind of is pretty wild. Some very high performance computing, but he's going to do it in a machine on a desktop. But I always like to see a picture, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And we can look at the back of these and get some idea of the connections. That looks like 4 DisplayPort connections. So those are more than likely, based on the look, an NVIDIA. But an NVIDIA, I'm not sure what. But they are definitely not an AMD GPU. My point. Now, I have seen another image with these GPUs, but I'm not finding it now. So let's say the information is changing. But we have seen riser cables in this, and I'd sure like to find out more about those riser cables. That's a pretty big deal. We can get a good idea here of the two power supplies in the back that are 1,600 watts each. And those, if you'll notice in this case, and this is going to come up when we get to the WRX80, which is the pinnacle of this, there's a circuit board that these power supplies plug into so that they can be hot swapped. Now, while I'm here, I want to show you, and I'm going to press F11 because I want you to see the URL where this is coming from. Look at the top of the page. You see where this is Gigabyte Enterprise GPU Server. I find that kind of fascinating. And then you look at the heading for the G182-C20. This is revision 100. Really? I think what they mean is revision 100. Anyway, AMD Ryzen Threadripper Server application, and as we said in the beginning, AI training, AI inference, and HPC. Okay, Gigabyte Enterprise GPU Server. I think what we're seeing is a delineation where we're talking consumer workstation that I'm going to get into in this next one versus a more of an enterprise type workstation. And, you know, change one thing changes everything. How this is positioned and what this can do, I would love to get my hands on one of these and test it, but I don't see that happening because, again, because of the depth, it just square peg in a round hole. We need a rack mount computer, which we're still going to work on another video. But based on the specs for what we have right now, because it has to be ATX, we're probably looking at the ProArt B550, which is a level 2 for 16 cores to fit that into a 4-unit rack mount case. We'll get there, but we got a lot more stuff because now we need to look at the pinnacle of success. And again, I'm just trying to hit the high points to tell you about this press release. I wanted to put this out sooner, but I've been trying to figure out the best way to present it, and I thought the best way to relate to this is how we talk about our 4 levels of computer builds. Entry level 1, secondary level 2, which they have a B550 for, which personally I prefer the Asus ProArt B550 Creator. Number 3 is the one we're looking at right now, which gets me excited because we've got a TRX40 in 1 unit rack mount, but the depth, that's a problem. Let's go to their number 3, which would be our number 4, which is WRX80. Now this one we're going to look at is the motherboard MC62-G40, and that motherboard is in that machine, which is the W771-Z, which is Z00. That case, same issue. Look at the depth of that rascal. That thing is huge. You got the motherboard that comes to about where my mouse is at, and then you got the extra space, and you got enough space, and I'll have a picture we can show a blow up, where we can have 2 racks of 4 drives each for SATA, and we still have 2 drive bays in the top of 5 1/4, and then 1 3.5. Now this is where things get really interesting because this is positioned for an enterprise workstation, which is different than the kind of workstations we've been talking about. First, let's look at the complete system, then we'll look at just the motherboard. And there's a lot of stenciling on that board that should exist that does not, but we will be able to glean enough details from it to get a good idea of what it's all about. Now this particular machine, notice the URL, we're at Gigabyte Enterprise Tower Server, and this is positioned with an AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro Tower GPU workstation application, AI training, AI inference, visual computing, and HPC. Okay, why is that a big deal? As always, details matter. Again, talking from 1 GPU to 2 GPUs to 4 GPUs, this is a machine that I would classify that I could put 4 GPUs in. Now, those of you that went to the WRX80, again, tried to use the Gigabyte on the WRX80 for multiple GPUs. Again, did not work. And again, I think that may be an issue that Gigabyte is addressing, because Gigabyte says on their WRX80 workstation that we've already looked at and talked about, of the 4 motherboards, of which we now have 5, this is number 5, multi-GPU support apparently is number 1. It's listed in several places. Thunderbolt is not shown. We're going to look at the motherboard. There's one possible place where there's a Thunderbolt connection, but I don't think it is. I think it has something to do with the SM bus. But let's look at this machine, how it's laid out. Look at the depth of this thing. It's big, and I'll just say that's not going to fit on a table that's 24 inches deep. That's going to have a deeper table because it's got the same issue that the TRX40 Rackmount has. Even though it is complete and it's perfect and it's all about function over form, because it's so deep, it's not going to sit 24 inches deep. It's got to have deeper. We'll get to it. Okay, let's go down the specs. This will support the Threadripper Pro, any one of the processors that you can get your hands on. It'll support 8-channel. And if you're going to do 8-channel, that's another conversation we need to have. One of our subscribers sent me a link about the issues with the different processors, about how much RAM the specific processor actually supports based on channels. Separate video. Dual 10 gigabit Ethernet and 1 gigabit LAN ports. And this also supports aggregation or teaming with those dual 10 gigabit Ethernet ports. We probably should do another video about that. Dedicated management port. Now this one says 7 slots. Yes, there are. But those 7 slots are actually 6 PCI Express 4.0 by 16. And there's 1 PCI Express 4.0 by 8 electrically. Says it'll support up to 8 3.5-inch drives, 2 M.2 NVMe drives, a default 6X system fan, and an optional external 2X GPU fan. And this is the part that got me excited. 2 2,000-watt CRPS RPSU 80 plus platinum power supplies. And that means, or defines as, CRPS common redundant power supply, and RPSU is redundant power supply unit. That means those are hot swap. That's pretty wicked. So I'm thinking about doing another video separate from this that'll talk about the 5 motherboards now, and looking at 5 different items that we would classify to pick any one of the motherboards, because if you change one thing, it changes everything. The first one is really easy. I've talked about it a lot. These other 4 are very interrelated, but I need to do a separate video about it because of the opportunities that this presents. It makes me take pause, and it's a possibility. I'll just say that. For consideration. Specifications. Down here, the operating system. And of course, we have, yes, extensive system management functions. The operating system, Windows 10 64-bit, 3 versions of Linux. Talks about the weight, the system fans. And I'm a little bit bummed about the fans because those are 80 millimeter fans. We stopped using 80 millimeter fans probably, I don't know what, 10 years ago. And here we've got 4 80 millimeter fans plus 2 more 80 millimeter fans. Those should be 120 millimeter fans. So that gives me some idea of how old this case is. But it is what it is. List the part numbers for a bare bone package, the motherboard, the I/O shield, which again is separate, CPU fan sink, power supply, the GPU fan module, additional hard drive cage, and based on, and I know what the case can do, but based on what the motherboard can do, I think 1 hard drive cage in there is enough for 4 drives. A rail kit, slide rail, handle, and rack ear, which means that can be rack mounted. Yeah, it opens up some opportunities, but it still has the same issue because of the depth that I won't go into again, but we've already covered. But it can be done where it can be used. And remember, this is positioned as an enterprise workstation. So of the 3 operating systems that we would classify Windows as being, let's go back up to the operating system compatibility. Okay, Windows 10 64-bit. I'm going to focus on that. Of the 3 operating systems that we would classify, number 1, Windows 10 Pro, 64-bit of course. Number 2, Windows Workstation, which we won't have to deal with as long as we're dealing with a motherboard that has 1 socket. When we go to a second socket, then we have to talk about Windows for Workstation. That's my understanding of how that works. Okay, then the third version of Windows, which is probably what this would have, would be Windows 10 Server, or excuse me, Windows Server, whatever it is right now. Because if you're going to do link aggregation, the Intel software supports it, Windows 10 Pro does not. I've had questions about that before, but Windows Server does support that link aggregation. So, you know, this change one thing changes everything, and, you know, what are your priorities? For a system like this, if I need that kind of bandwidth, then you might be wanting to install a Mellanox adapter. I'll leave it at that because some of you have talked about those. That way you can still use Windows 10 Pro because it's a whole lot less expensive and a whole lot easier to do, because it's more about what you're trying to accomplish, not what the operating system has involved. Because then you get into all those licensing issues with Windows Server. So our goal is, let's keep it simple and make it work. Over here under storage, there was mention previously of Broadcom, and I don't see that mentioned now. All it says is a SACE card, serial attached SCSI, is required for SACE device support. But looking at this yesterday, I thought I saw specifically Broadcom mentioned in here. Gigabyte's got a good way of scrubbing their information and changing it. Now, I will point out here it talks about RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 5, and RAID 10. Okay, RAID 5 is supposed to be about the ability to hot swap, and AMD will say specifically, because there's 3 levels of RAID: a hardware RAID, which is what you would want for RAID 5. But if you try to do RAID 5 on the AMD RAID, according to their documentation, do not do hot swap, because that's the other 2 levels of RAID. 1, a BIOS bootable hybrid RAID, and number 2, a software RAID, which is not bootable. But this did mention support for a Broadcom card, and it's not here now. Interesting. And under support over here on the left, looking at BIOS, well, that's interesting. I don't remember seeing information about BIOS, but they're now showing a BIOS update available, 9/27 of 2021. FO4 and the utility for the flash. Okay, we don't have a manual yet. That's still the same. Everything is about the GSM. Well, I don't remember seeing that. User guide, BIOS setup manual. That's new. I'll have to dig into that later. That says that was available on 9/5/2017. Well, that's not going to be a unified EFI BIOS, but it has to be to support some of these newer technologies. I'll have to dig into that and see what that's got. But I do not remember seeing that before, but I'm pointing it out to you guys now. So the next thing to do, let's go look at these images, because again, I think a picture's worth 1,000 words. It tells me more. It's got a door on the front, not a fan of that. Looking at the back, this is just with the motherboard in case. We can get an idea at the top where we can see we have our 2 power supplies for redundant. Management console access, 1, 2, 3, 4 LAN ports, and there is 1 USB-C port. Nice. What I want to see is this view. We can get a look at the front of the case. There's a hot swap rack in there for 4 drives, so that's got a passive backplane, connects to the motherboard. And then you got a space down here for a second one can be installed. But if I were to put a Broadcom card in this, then I would use one of these top bays with an IC dock to put 4 M.2 NVMe drives in one of those spaces. So 2 5.25 bays and 1 3.5. And that would allow us to do hot swap on 4 M.2 NVMe drives on a Broadcom card. And we'll get a better picture of the side view of the motherboard as we get to it. Yeah, this side view I like because it shows population. We have our racks, top and bottom, again with the passive backplane. We get an idea of the motherboard, and we can clearly see those are 4 NVIDIA GPUs. Now, I think the first thing to point out with these 4 GPUs, they are directly attached to the motherboard, and the way the slot number identification works on that motherboard, it looks like from the bottom up instead of top down. However, what I want to say is these 4 NVIDIA GPUs, number 1, are not connected, and number 2, because they're 2 slot, I wonder if these are A100s. I'm just thinking out loud. I don't know. We'll get a better view picture of the motherboard when we look at just the motherboard. Because remember, this is the system in a case, and this case can be rack mounted. Y'all saw the information on the specs, and you get an idea of how deep this thing is from front to back. Like I said, that's not going to sit on a regular table, but I'll leave that for you guys to do some more research on. I want to get the information to you to tell you what's going on, because when I heard about this, I'm like, wow, tell me more. I hear enough to know I want to know more, and the more I learn, the more I realize the more I need to know, because I realize how little I know. Okay, that covers 3. The piece de resistance is this motherboard, the WRX80, which is the MC62-G40. And again, look up here at the link. This is Gigabyte Enterprise Server Motherboard. Even though it says a Workstation server motherboard says server operating system. So let's go back up and take a look at the images. for the MC62-G40. And I want to get to the other view. Now that's a good view to look at the I/O. First thing I think to point out here, on this I/O panel, there is no I/O panel. It's a separate I/O shield like we used to have. Right down here we have one USB-C port, USB 3, USB 3, and there's our 4 network ports, audio on board of course, and there's access to the management console. Now this is the picture that really matters the most, looking at the overview. And I'm going to start at the bottom and work our way up. And as I mentioned earlier, the stenciling on this board is pretty sparse. The only stenciling, you'll see right up here where I highlight, where it says Gigabyte and the model number of the motherboard and some of the information that's required for certification. But stenciling that identifies the slots is non-existent. However, let's start here on the bottom right. This is probably for the I/O. So right down here, that's for 2 USB 3 ports, 2 USB 3 ports, and these have got to be for all of our fans. I'm not sure about that one. And this one is probably a PEG connector, which they would call PCI Express graphics. In other words, additional power to the bus. Back over here on the right side, that one is, I'm not quite sure. I don't want to jump the gun. I will say without the manual, where the mouse is at, what I'm pointing at, that's probably a 5-pin connector, and it kind of looks like something to do with the system management bus. I could be wrong on that because I haven't seen the book, but that's my guess. If I were being optimistic, I would say that might be Thunderbolt 3, but highly doubtful. Here's our SATA stacked, so there's 2, 4, and then 1, 2, 3 for the SACE. And I'm going to come back down here to this M.2 connector because this is significant. We saw it on the other motherboard. That's a thermistor. Thermistor 1, and right up here on the right, thermistor 2 for this M.2 connector. So to me that's significant that we're now seeing thermistors on the motherboard to watch the heat on the M.2 NVMe drives, and this is PCI Express 4.0. Now this fan right here, of course, is going to be the chipset. We'll scroll on up on the right, 2 8-pin power taps, and the primary 24-pin power tap up here is the top right, and there's one fan control, obviously for the CPU. I'm not sure about, and looking at anything on the MOSFET, you know, we don't see any kind of humongous heat sink on there, which kind of leaves me scratching my head, I'll say. Orientation of the board we can see for our I/O panel on the left, so I've got north, south, east, and west, which to me makes the most sense. Some of the boards turn them, which makes it difficult to compare apples and apples. And of course we've got our battery. I'm going to start talking about the battery because somebody had asked me about the Asus WRX80 not having a battery. It did, it's just it was under one of the cowlings. You couldn't see it, which again was kind of odd. And no numbering on these slots, but I've seen another picture that looked like these slots numbered bottom up instead of top down. So hold your thought on that, but all we know is there are 7 slots by 16 mechanically, but only 6 by 16 electrically. One of these, which it defines as number 2, whichever direction you go from, number 2 is supposed to be by 8 electrically. And I hadn't noticed this till just now. I'm going to go over here on the right side. That's one of those oops wires where they had to rewire something because the trace on the motherboard didn't do it. And there's another oops wire where they had to rewire a trace. So we're not looking at a production board. We're looking at a board that was pre-production. Still had some testing to be done. So based on the layout of these thermistors, I hope the thermistors will still be there. But based on the layout of these oops wires, let's hope they've solved that. But if anybody gets their hands on one of these, tell us more about it. Tell us what you think of it. And one last thought. That says 7, but it's actually 6 PCI Express 4.0 slots for multi-GPU. Okay, if we do a quick search on the page for information about multi-GPU, Gigabyte has again updated this page because it's set in here in at least 2 or 3 places to reiterate talking about multi-GPU support. They have scrubbed that information and it only says it in one place. So I'm glad I've waited to share this information, but it's apparently in a state of flux. What we know when the press release came out versus I checked this last night, what we now know, there's some things that are changing. I thought it was significant to share with you this press release, and I want to relate these 4 things they had as it related to our 4 different levels of builds, from our primary to the secondary to the 3rd level, high-end desktop, to the workstation on top, which is where this machine is at. I'm kind of mixed on it. Anything that has to do with the TRX40 or the WRX80, I'm all excited to learn about and share about. And what had me going on this was because in multiple places, one, it talked about a Broadcom for hardware RAID, that's been scrubbed. 2, it talked about multi-GPU support, which only mentions it twice, and I say that now because, to reiterate, 2 of you have tried the Gigabyte board on the WRX80 that would not do multi-GPU support. I believe the first was with 4, like we use here, TRX80 20 Ti's, no go. Then the second one was trying to use 4 3090s, and they wanted to use the riser cables, and I said that's not going to work. And we've seen Gigabyte has a riser cable, so my suggestion is if you can get your hands on that riser cable, you might be able to make that work the way you were trying, that we can't work with the regular consumer cables. So we get something out of this. This is something to watch. And as we look at the machines, how I would classify this, if this can be used for multi-GPU support, as they claim, it would be a candidate of 3 that I would pick for multi-GPU support. But I'll get into that in another video. So I want to thank you guys for watching. My name's Gil Boyd. This is Builder Buy. We're on to the next video. We're out.